In today's video, I'm going to show you the steps on how I keg our kombucha. We make 6 gallons of kombucha every 9 to 10 days. We use 2-gallon containers, and we have 3 of them. Since we do make kombucha every 9 to 10 days, it got very time-consuming bottling that kombucha. And then we also would have to let that kombucha sit in the bottles for a couple days to do a second ferment. We've eliminated that whole process by doing kegging. We start off with a continuous brew method, as I said, and we go ahead and after the first ferment is done, I go ahead and I put it into the keg. Make the flavor of the kombucha right into the keg itself. Then we force carbonate the keg for 24 hours. And from there, we're ready to serve in 24 hours. We find that this method is much easier to dispense and takes all that process of having to use bottles, clean bottles, and that whole entire second ferment. And not to mention the storage space necessary for 6 gallons if you put them all into bottles. So I'm going to show you the steps from making the tea to taking the kombucha from the canisters and putting them into the keg. Today's kombucha is going to be Asian ginger pear. The ingredients is the Asian pears with cinnamon sticks and ginger. And I will give you those amounts that we're going to use in the 5 gallons. So let's get started. Okay, to make the tea, to replace the tea I'm going to be taking off the containers for the new kombucha, I start with about 5 quarts of water. And basically it's for each gallon of kombucha I'm making, I use 1 cup of sugar. And also the tea, which I like to use pure leaf tea, and I use 2 different kinds of tea. I use the classic black tea, and I use gunpowder green tea. For each one of my batches for a gallon, I use 4 teaspoons of loose leaf tea. So I split it 50-50 with the black and the green tea. So I measure out my tea into a bowl, and I have black tea and green tea. What I like to do is I like to get my water just before it boils. I don't like it to get it to a rolling boil. Temperature to just about 180 to 185. I'm going to steep my tea for 1 hour. My sugar also will be added and dissolved at the same time. So let's go ahead and start dissolving some sugar. I like to pour it in and I'll stir it and I'll just make sure it all just dissolves. And that is how I make my tea for my replacement. I'll let that sit for about an hour, and then I will add that to a bucket where I will add cool water to it to get the temperature down to a safe level so I can add it to the new batch and not harm the SCOBY. These are the containers that I brew my kombucha in. These were set up on 410, and today is the 21st. This kombucha is ready to be processed now, so I'm going to remove the SCOBYs, and I put them into a plastic bowl that's been washed and sanitized with vinegar. I will also strain my kombucha into a 5-gallon bucket through this strainer, fine mesh strainer here. At this time I will also pull off my starter fluid for my next batch when I get ready to start that. So I'll pull off at least, I like to use 2 cups per gallon. So I'll pull off 12 cups. So the first thing I like to do is I like to pull off starter. Like I said, I'm going to pull off about 12 cups. So this 5-gallon bucket here, I'll be pouring in a mixture of all 3 of these so I can disperse the flavoring. There might be slight flavoring differences between the batches, but they're all made the same. Okay, I've also been asked, what is the pH of your kombucha when you are done? Well, this kombucha's been brewing for 11 days. I don't always measure the pH of my kombucha. I mostly go by taste. But I do have a pH meter here. And let's go ahead and see what this kombucha is after 11 days. Kombucha is at 3.5 after 11 days. Which, according to documents that I've read, 3.5 is a good number to be at. 3.4, actually, it's coming up now. But the taste to me is what I go by, and this has just enough of a tart taste to it. And this is the formula we've been using for the last 6 months, and it's been working pretty good. Okay. The containers have been washed. I never wash these with soap. They're always rinsed with warm water and cleaned and dried with clean towels. I've chosen to do the batch method versus the continuous brew method. I find that it's easier to keep quality control and keep the same flavor profile each time. After I've washed and dried them, I go ahead and I put a little bit of white vinegar in each one of them before I put the scobies back in. And I like to just mix it all around in the jar to make sure it coats the surfaces of the jar. And I've had no problem with any kind of mold on my scobies. And I believe that is just in making sure you properly prepare your containers each time. I use coffee filters over them while they're brewing. And I keep them in a well-ventilated area out of the sunlight. This is a 5-gallon keg made by Keggco. The system I use, I bought on Amazon. To sanitize my kegs, I like to use Star San. I make a 2.5-gallon bucket of it every couple weeks. After I mix that up, I will flush my lines out between brews, clean the lines first, flush them with water, and then I will flush them with the Star San sanitizer. I also will sanitize the keg for probably roughly 30 minutes, periodically shaking it up. Contact time is 2 minutes on this stuff. It's really fast, it's really good. I've had no problems with any of my parts growing any kind of mold or anything. I'll take the actual keg dispensing parts apart every month to make things easier, pouring my kombucha and my sanitizers into my keg. I've got this giant food grade funnel. It's also got a little screen in it, so if anything I missed in the initial screening of the kombucha, usually I'll catch anything else right in here. But for now, I'm going to pour my sanitizer back into my bucket, because I've already sanitized this, and this has been soaking for a good hour. You know how the Star San is working because it creates bubbles. As long as it's still creating bubbles, then the solution is still active. And it makes a lot of bubbles. Now, the bubbles will not hurt your kombucha. The next step is I'm going to take this tea that I've been letting steep for an hour, and I'm going to add it to this bucket. I'm going to strain it through a filter to get the loose tea out. If you were using tea bags, you wouldn't have to worry about it. You could just fish the tea bags out. But since I'm using loose leaf tea, it's still much easier to use a filter. The temperature of the tea right now is about 120 degrees. That's way too hot for your SCOBY. So what I'll do is I'll add it to the bucket, and then I will add this water. I use bottled water. I'll add about 2.5 gallons to this to cool it down, And then I will divide that tea mixture, the sweet tea mixture, between these 3 containers. And then I will fill the rest of it up with the bottled water. All right, and now the water. I'll give this a good stir. And now I'll also check the temperature. 80 degrees. I'll divide this sweet tea mixture between these 3 containers. Okay, now I've divided the sweet tea amongst the 3 containers. And now what I'll do is I'll top off each up to this line. All right, I got my sweet tea divided up. My next step is now to add my starter to each one of these containers. I have 12 cups of starter, so I'm going to put 4 cups in each one of these containers. The next step is we add the pears and the ginger and the cinnamon sticks to the bag. All right, the next step is we're going to add the bags to the kombucha in the keg. Now I got the keg filled with the kombucha. I'm going to force carbonate it at 30 psi. Since this keg is filled almost to the top, there's not a lot of headspace for CO2. So what I'll do is I'll vent out the air first once I connect the hose, and then vent it out and make sure there's no air in there. Then force carbonate it, and then I'll let it sit for 24 hours. I will invert the keg once or twice in the 24 hours just to move the CO2 around. Okay, on this keg, I bought a special lid that has a hose that goes to a CO2 stone that runs to the bottom of the keg. The stone helps with dispersing the CO2 into very fine bubbles. It's not necessary to have that. You could just hook the hose up to the input side, and then it will force the CO2 down, but in large bubbles. I find that the small, finer bubbles work really nice and help speed up the process. So I'm going to take this hose, I'm going to connect it to the center peg on this lid, and then I'm going to turn on the CO2. Right now the CO2 is going into the tank, and I'll start to vent the air out. And what venting the air out does is gives more room for the CO2 to go into that space, and plus the air removal from the tank helps with oxidation. I'll invert the tank, give it a good shake up. That is it for the process of kegging kombucha. We'll come back in 24 hours. We'll prime the system here, and we'll give that kombucha a try. Okay, it's been 24 hours. The pear kombucha is ready to dispense. I'm going to show you the finished product. That is pear kombucha on tap. If you have any questions, please ask in the comment section below. If you like this, please subscribe. I will be trying to do some more videos about kombucha and water kefir. Thank you for watching. In today's video, I'm going to show you the steps on how I keg our kombucha. We make 6 gallons of kombucha every 9 to 10 days. We use 2-gallon containers, and we have 3 of them. Since we do make kombucha every 9 to 10 days, it got very time-consuming bottling that kombucha. And then we also would have to let that kombucha sit in the bottles for a couple days to do a second ferment. We've eliminated that whole process by doing kegging. We start off with a continuous brew method, as I said, and we go ahead and after the first ferment is done, I go ahead and I put it into the keg. Make the flavor of the kombucha right into the keg itself. Then we force carbonate the keg for 24 hours. And from there, we're ready to serve in 24 hours. We find that this method is much easier to dispense and takes all that process of having to use bottles, clean bottles, and that whole entire second ferment. And not to mention the storage space necessary for 6 gallons if you put them all into bottles. So I'm going to show you the steps from making the tea to taking the kombucha from the canisters and putting them into the keg. Today's kombucha is going to be